So hi Jim, nice to talk to you again on Time Team Tea Time.
Hello,
I
Tim.
looked up on IMDb. You were down as producer slash prisoner for the Appleby program.
Was that
And
just a general description of my role? And that was specific to Appleby, was
yeah,
it?
yes, that works sometimes. But I remember those days after you've been in there for a bit. It was fairly traumatic. But just going back, was Appleby one of your site suggestions?
No, Appleby was back in the day when I was a lowly field archaeologist for Time Team. So it was before I had any kind of behind the camera role.
Yeah.
So I seem to remember that Simon Rakes, you remember Simon, the producer at the time, had asked for volunteers from the digging team, and people seemed fairly reluctant to put their hands up. So for some reason, I found myself saying, "I'll do it. Yeah, sounds great." And yes, a bizarre and strange experience, as I'm sure you recall.
Because I think we all got slightly worried. I remember that the prospect of having you as a prisoner, you weren't allowed to talk directly to anybody. And it seemed that it sort of galvanized some of the more sadistic inclinations of the production team who were told they had to treat you like a prisoner. And after
Well,
a day or two, I think it got to you, didn't it?
I think we ought to put it into context a little bit because what we were trying to illustrate was the change between the way that prisons had worked pre 1850, maybe even earlier, I should suspect, where prisons were just open and families would go in together and you ate, you drank, you smoked, whatever. There wasn't really, you were just confined. There wasn't really any sort of inverted commas punishment, so to speak. Yeah, have you got the picture? Yeah, there you go. I remember it well. Yeah.
Victor's drawings in
So
that's
yes,
drawing in archaeology.
there we go. Fantastic. So the change was a sort of emerging puritanism in the country and thinking that the punishment should mean punishment. And so effectively prisoners went into solitary and were given a very rough prison uniform. They were manacled anytime they left their cells. And the idea was that you had to pay for your sins effectively. You paid for your sins through physical labor and prayer. So anytime you came out of the cell, you had to do a physical task. Often that wouldn't be something like a chain gang in America where they're building a road or they're doing something helpful. It would deliberately be a monotonous and pointless task. So I think one of the tasks I had was, the pointless one was turning, and it was a real machine where you had to turn a crank handle and it made numbers on a dial go up. And that was it. And so I'd just be instructed to turn this handle for 3 hours and think about my sins, you know. But I was dragged outside into the, blinking into the bright light of day to break rocks. And to come back to your point about the production team being somewhat sadistic, the lovely Kerry, who of course we all love, our logistics manager, decided it would be amusing if you found some granite. And as you may or may not know, granite doesn't break when you hit it with a hammer. So there's these ridiculous scenes of me trying to break this granite up and the hammer's just bouncing off the rock. And so he found that very amusing. But I think I actually stood my ground on one thing, which was that the historian was insistent that I remove my underpants to wear this prison outfit, this Hessian prison outfit, and I refused. I drew the line there at realism, I'm afraid. But yeah, I mean, we should probably talk about the effect that it had on everybody. I mean, it's not just me.
Yeah, I mean, because I was quite worried about you after about the second day, because it did seem to have just that process of being treated like that, not being able to look at anybody, not being able to talk with anybody. It seemed really tough. But it reminded me of those time teams where the historical reconstruction, we actually got one of you guys to play a role.
Yes.
from the past. I think we had Jenny playing a nun.
She was a nun. That's right.
The most jovial one was Matt playing a. Do you remember Matt?
The navvy.
The navvy.
Yeah.
Where
amongst his many starring roles. Yeah.
Careful research showed us that the navvies drank, what was it, 8 pints a day?
Something like that. It was a couple of pints with every meal or something
So he
like
said
that. Of course, it would have been weak beer in those days, but Kerry, again, just gave him like 5% ale. So by the end of the day, he was completely half cut.
And he said it was quite a happy state, by and large, to be in. If you were going to do physical labor, you might as well be happy with it.
Absolutely.
Do you think those things work from a time team point of view, from the viewer's point of view? Do you think it did add something to get you guys to play a role?
It's an interesting question, because I always felt that the cameos, as we call them, if Time Team was about the process of archaeology and about explaining to a general audience, in effect, the scientific method, how we investigate something, how we go through something, how we find answers, and in fact, how we frame questions, the cameos, I thought, best worked when they were a piece of experimental archaeology. So we were trying to recreate an artifact that we'd found, or a process, or something like that. I mean, Phil's been involved in some of the best ones we've ever done. When it came to the reenactments slightly different, because it's an experiential thing. And, you see those reenactors dressing up and having Civil War battles. Well, that's not about what people are getting from it watching. It's really the experiences for them. And so, again, going back to your beginning comments, for me, it was much more personal. And strangely enough, it was much more personal for the policeman who played the guard, and in fact, for everybody who was watching. So whilst the television adds a different aspect to it, because I was able to keep that video diary, which tried to get across something of what I was feeling and experiencing. But, to use a cliche, you had to be there, to be perfectly honest. I mean, there were several things that came out of it that the viewers won't be aware of. And one of those was the peculiar result in terms of the relationship between myself and that policeman, because he somewhat enjoyed his role a little bit, or at least it felt to me, I should say, he enjoyed his role a little bit too much. And because he was genuine in his role and I was a beaten down, downtrodden prisoner, even when it was over and we were back in civvies and we were in the pub, I couldn't look him in the eye and I couldn't speak to him. I just, that abuser relationship had been established in a very short sort of space of time. So, that did get across a tiny fraction of what those experiences must have been like in the past. But I think for the viewer, it's more entertaining than anything else. Certainly, Matt being slightly drunk or dressed as a Roman or whatever it might be, it's more sort of entertaining. I don't think any of us expected, and Tony talks about this on camera, none of us expected that experiment to have the effect it had on the rest of the crew. And that was the very strange thing, that everyone digging, and they felt bad for me because I looked like I was so miserable. I think they felt bad and slightly guilty, I hope.
I think you appear, that is maybe you in a Victor picture there, sat in the jail looking a bit...
Looking miserable, yeah. Yeah.
It was interesting with the Jenny one, that too, I was quite concerned about, because the head of the abbess asked her to prostrate herself, and wow. That sounds like, oh, okay, I'll just lie down on the ground. But if a nun is asked to prostrate herself, which is a kind of punishment, it has a funny effect on the breathing when you're lying flat on the ground. And it's sort of, we were suddenly dealing with not physical objects, artifacts or information, but we were dealing with, the personal reaction of someone we all knew and cared for. And she stuck to her guns with it. And she said it was extremely tough, to find herself in those circumstances. I'm just thinking of the archaeology of Appleby. I mean, I felt we got something out of it, that going for that later site. I mean, what was it, 19th century, basically?
Yes.
How did you
Yes.
feel? Did it sort of produce the archaeology that made it worthwhile you going through that degree of suffering?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I felt slightly detached from the archaeology, as you might imagine.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the things for me, I mean, there were several artifacts that came up that were extraordinary. I'm sure we found a key, and we found the bottom of a hobnailed boot, I seem to recall, a prison boot, the same boot that my jailer was wearing, that I used to hear clip-clopping down the corridor and dread the jangle of the key in the door. Get outside, move, whatever it might be. But I seem to remember that we humanized the thing by finding the remnants of an escape. Do you remember that? Where they blocked up a tunnel that had been dug with boulders, and we had the record of the escape. And so it's when you have, the great thing about these historic sites is that you can marry documentary evidence along with what you're finding in the ground, often to a named individual, just as we did there. So definitely worthwhile. Not the prettiest of sites in the world, I think we have to say. It was basically a car park. But I think the archaeology told a story. And in fact, the fact that the site wasn't very pretty, and the fact that you're effectively just digging cells, meant that my, whatever you want to call it, cameo experiment, actually helped add color to the whole experience. So, it's, going back to your question, do you think those sorts of things are useful? Well, we have to recognize that it's an exercise in public archaeology. So it's TV. So something like that is you wouldn't do that if you're on a research excavation. But as a piece of television, it helps tell the story. And that's what we're about, telling a story. So from that perspective, I often think those things were quite funny, and they were enjoyable,
And it was a bit like watching one of Victor's pictures come to life almost. I mean, particularly because he then drew you, and I think he drew Jenny in role, as it were. And it's that moment, as you know, we've been talking about various authors who write about the historical period, where they're trying to get inside characters who are close to being historic, or invented characters in the same circumstance. And there's an interesting point that, so if you were saying to someone, I think you should watch Appleby, why do you think it would be a good program to watch?
Well, I can only really answer from a personal perspective, and to me, it's definitely what I found interesting. And I remember there's a whole sequence with Carenza talking about this in the show, where we talk about the historical context, and to me, it's that change in the mentality that led from these group prisons and the sort of reform of the prison system, which in fact is not, too far away from what we still have today, to be perfectly honest, in particular with the design of cells and the idea of solitary and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that tells us a lot about the change in the psychology of us as a country, really, at that period in history. So I think to me, it's the historical element of it, which is the reason I would watch it. I must admit, I find it difficult to go back and watch that program. But if your viewers are interested in any behind-the-scenes stories, I've got a few of those I can relate as well. I remember you being very kind to me, in particular, and Kerry, I think, felt guilty about the incident with the granite.
We did discuss. I discussed with one or two people pulling you out of it early. I didn't like to see what was happening to you. But somehow the fact that having started it and the fact that you stuck with it, there did seem to be some kind of truth coming out of your experience. And I'm not sure how many people ever get near to realizing what it's like to be incarcerated and being under the thumb of whatever person who might be kind and helpful or might be sadistic. That's the luck of the draw, isn't it? And,
Yeah, I mean, for us, soft
yeah.
as anything, sort of academics, I couldn't. I mean, I didn't do it for very long. I can't imagine the psychological effect of doing that for months or even years. I don't know how you'd get through that. And I remember one of the facts, the factoids that emerged from the historical studies was that suicides went through the roof when they changed to this new system. They had people killing themselves left, right, and centre, and I'm not surprised.
And I can't remember. Were you on bread and water, or what was your diet?
Oh God! Don't remind me. Bread would have been a luxury, frankly. It was historically accurate, thanks to the historian. I don't know how to describe it. It's gruel, effectively. It's inedible. I don't even know what it's made of. I think it's the husks of wheat or something. It's not even actual wheat, foul, grey, tasteless liquid. And again, the idea was break the prisoner down, break the prisoner down, break the prisoner down. Because quite often it wasn't, as I said, there's a number of things. You've got, your diet is effectively gone. You're not being given anything that's actually capable of giving you the energy to then do the physical tasks. So again, you're being broken down. And I can imagine the psychological effect that would have. Then there's the weird part of it, which is this puritanical religious aspect where I would be made to kneel in the cell and pray and think about my sins. And I couldn't move from the kneeling position because every 10, 15, maybe 20, I don't know when minutes, he'd come and look through the, spy hole to make sure I was still in a kneeling position. So you've constantly got this spectre hovering over your shoulder. You lose all sense of individuality. That was another aspect.
I think we probably ought to pull you out of that so you don't get any flashbacks. When you started doing your own programs, the sites that you found, selected, that had gone through the process and you actually got to do them, were there some where the reconstruction or the reenactment brought it to life in a way that you were really pleased about? Were there some sites where that moment of seeing the thing being made or reconstructed, or people living in that sort of cultural way, made you think, oh, that was great? I remember, were you involved in the big Saxon one where we had sea wolfing? We had the boat and a whole bunch of Saxons living by the side of a river.
Was that a documentary?
We had Saxon cooking. We'd often have Jackie Wood doing prehistoric cooking and things like that. Do you remember any of the cameos that were part of your programs you were involved in?
I remember burning Raksha on a funeral pyre. That was quite entertaining.
Was that one of your shows?
Well, I didn't. I wasn't involved in sort of directing that, but it certainly, it's one of the.
You researched it.
I found, yeah. And
I remember that sight of Raksha on that great pile of wood.
Mm-hmm.
Why was
Sam reading a eulogy? Do you remember?
Sam Newton, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Sam gave the eulogy in Saxon, of course, in Old English. But yeah, again, they're the ones that I really like because we burnt the funeral pyre, obviously without Raksha on it, and it then provided us with physical evidence that we could match to the evidence that we were finding in the field. So, that to me is always the best. And quite often when they don't go right. So we did one with the soldiers for Operation Nightingale that never made it into the show. And we had a rather eccentric sort of reenactment type guy there. And the idea was that we were going to melt down various metals and we were going to make I think it was a brooch that was the same design as the one that they found in one of the graves. And we shot that thing, my God, it must have taken a day of my time to try and get this thing right. I was shooting it and directing it. And we just couldn't get it to work. Either the mold would break or the metal wouldn't go in properly or it wouldn't set correctly. But the strange thing was that we got a sort of not even a half decent brooch out at the end. We got thing that looked terrible, to be perfectly honest. But I did conduct an interview with the soldier who did it. And he said exactly what you're talking about. He said, I feel closer to the people. I understand the skill it must have taken to make the object. You know, really, I understand why the object meant something and why it was placed in the grave, because there's that element of this has taken craft and care and has been cared for, and therefore it's important, you know. So all of that has value because and he was excavating the grave. So it helps him understand the significance of what he's working on.
And I think I remember Jackie McKinley talking about the usefulness of an archaeologist being able to look at a site, a cremation site, post the event. The stains it leaves in the ground, the kind of way the archaeology burns, the kind of small pits that are left, and the effect of that amount of heat. And it therefore meant to her that when she went to other sites where she knew all this stuff already, she could be a bit more, she'd have this sort of image in her head of what that thing looked like just after it was burnt, effectively.
That's right.
I think that the one I enjoyed, I remember the thing about the cameos was it always felt like a bit of time off from the archaeology, because normally we'd have Uncle Phil there doing it. We used to drag him off to do the cameos. And we did one where we had a chap and his son come down from Scotland to do glass. And we had some Roman glass from London, real Roman glass. They've got stacks of it down there in bits. Yeah. And these guys overnight smelted down this glass. And the smoke and the fire and the thing burning at night, it was visually very good. So I think that's why it was so exciting.
Yeah, I think often with those ones, you get an idea of the labor effort required to produce. You know, quite often we think about the objects and we say, you know, we have this piece of pottery, that means it's dated X, it fits here in the sequence, you know, blah, blah, blah. And you don't think about somebody's had to go and get that clay, sort out the temper, build the kiln, put it in there, look after it, bring the wood for the fire, break it all down, get it out, transport it, sell it. You know, there's a whole sequence around that one object that often you don't even think about when you're in a trench, you know. So for that reason, I think they can be, you know, incredibly useful.
And I remember when we were working with Francis on Flag Fen, we had that interesting moment where the bronze maker had insisted that having made the objects from bronze, I think it was a spearhead, something like that, he then wanted to put some bronze back into the lake, make an offering. And Francis, bless him, waded in the final shot and deposited some bronze back. And you did feel that was a cycle that only someone who'd been intimately involved in bronze production would get why it was so important.
Yeah, yeah, you're removing something from the earth and you're returning something.
I've just had some fun looking at the objects that Athelstan received from King Constantine. It's like a classic Discovery television series in the making.
Okay.
With enough excitement and lack of the possibility of actually finding it. But there's a wonderful story about these objects because Athelstan's daughter was about to marry Hugh of France, and the King of France sent him a whole package of amazing objects, which included the spear of Longinus, all sorts of things that originally came from Jerusalem. There's an amazing list of these amazing objects, and the Annals of Exeter Cathedral happened to record these being given to Exeter to be stored there. And so there actually was a record of these objects, which is rather extraordinary. But it made me think of, as a researcher and developer, are there some sites and subjects and questions that you would, given you had a whole time team, all the experts you wanted, everybody, all the technology you could possibly want, did you ever come across sites that you wanted answered? You think, I would love to have had an answer to that. And that's a very difficult question, I know, but I just wondered if in your all those years you were doing it, where there was some things that you thought, I wish we could have taken a whole team and spent more time perhaps looking for that? What are the big questions of British archaeology? And for me, I would probably start with the beaker pottery and that transition from metalwork to that seems to come in with those beaker pots. That early Bronze Age seems to me very important.
Well, I think you've hit on something there, because the wonderful thing about Great Britain as a set of islands is that we have gone through so many transitions with different peoples coming in, and it is those, as Francis might say, the liminal spaces between that they're the interesting bits. So yeah, transition into use of metals. Why? Where did that come from? The whole feeding into the mythology, you know, the idea that the sword and the stone might have something to do with actually making metal objects, and the fact you would use stone as the, you know, I love that strange transition between the nitty-gritty fact, if you like, of the archaeology and the sort of slightly hazy mythology. Where do they meet what's real and what isn't? I think on another transitional sort of thing, I like the Northumbrian coast and the Vikings coming in. I like the early Saxon sites up there, and there are a couple of churches that I would love to have done, or a couple of religious sites that I would have loved to have done. One of which is to do with a saint, a female saint whose name escapes me, and the site was a promontory fort which had an early Christian monastery built on top of it. And she was, there was some legend about her. Did she commit suicide or something happened? She was an Anglo-Saxon princess that didn't want to marry or do any of that stuff and went to God. And again, we know nothing about this site, but it strikes me a multi-period site with all these wonderful, juicy secrets that you know it holds. And again, I think at the time, it was too similar to something else we were doing, and it never made it. And then
I think we did one with some nuns up in that part
that
of
neck of the
landscape.
woods.
Yeah. It was like the nuns in the back terrace of somewhere or other.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that may have been. And interestingly, somebody's been talking to me recently about the Battle of Bruneberg, which was this very, very critical battle. And if we hadn't been successful, the Anglo-Saxons, we'd probably all be talking in Danish now, which wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. I rather like the Danes, but but that was, I suppose, turning point battles. We've also talked with someone recently about Tewkesbury, which was the penultimate battle of the 100 Years' War. And again, the fact that battle was won changed the rest of history, really, after that moment. Although battles, as you know, are a bit of a nightmare to do. So I love your idea of that Viking promontory fort. And knowing what you do about archaeology, are there still some sites that slightly make you shudder? If we, in a nice way, I mean, if we were to send you out on a quest and you had one site to crack, are there places that you've been that you've thought, my God, I can sort of feel history, I can feel time here?
I thought by shudder you meant sites that you know I wouldn't dream of going near. Preservation's the thing. So you know, I don't want to fall back on cliches here, but sites that I found really exciting are sites like Caerleon, and of course it's a well-known, you know, Roman site with upstanding remains and all the rest of it. But the fact it was such a critical military site, and it's so early, at least a good deal of it's so early, and the fact that you can dig just about anywhere there, and the stuff that comes out of the ground is unbelievable. I mean, it's mind-blowing. Certainly for so remote in terms of the Roman Empire, you know, it's incredible. So sites like that are juicy because you know you can't lose. You know, you're going to find exciting stuff. on the other hand, I am rather fond of the Anglo-Saxons and early medieval history, but a bit like Helen. So those sites, although they're quite often very ephemeral, I find those very interesting indeed.
I thought I was really, looking back on this, I was delighted that we worked with Helena Hamerow on the big hall,
yes,
the big Anglo-Saxon hall we found, because to say you're going to find an Anglo-Saxon hall is a pretty amazing long shot.
Yeah.
And partly because of the research she'd done there and all the rest of it. To actually see those posts that supported a hall that was, did it end up being just slightly shorter or longer than Yevering? I can't remember.
It was the largest Anglo-Saxon longhouse ever discovered in the UK. And I think people, quite often with Time Team, people don't realise how significant some of our discoveries have been. The Quadruple temple complex, do you remember that? The first temples, there's a couple of those sites. There's Brancaster Roman Fort, where we found the first set of really well-preserved mausolea that had been excavated in the UK for 150 years. None had been touched by modern archaeology, and the temples were the same. So I think for me, Time Team is an interesting. I've always it was such an interesting intellectual thing to do, because it's about the story. And for me, those pivotal sites you're talking about, the site is a springboard. So long as we can, for the TV, as long as we can tick the box of being fairly sure that there are some archaeological questions in the ground that we can answer, and that we're going to find something, so that it's not just a load of stones in the ground. It's about everything else that comes off the back of that, the broader story, so the local, regional, national, and international story that we might be able to spin from that single site. Because it's a story about people and humans at the end of the day. It's not myopic, it's a big thing.
Yeah. And I was it Charlton that what was the name of the Anglo-Saxon hall site we did with Helena? And I think Sam was there as well. I've got to.
That was Sutton Courtenay, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that big hall that we excavated. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting. I might come back to you at some future point and say because I feel a bit like you that because we were only doing it in 3 days, we were evaluating the geophysics and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Across those 250 sites, there was some fairly exceptional finds, and I don't think we particularly blew our own trumpet about some of them.
I don't think we did. We often had to defend ourselves in a number of ways, and it would often be about how much money we'd invested in archaeology over the 20 years and things like that. But actually, that's not really what it's about. Mick often said this, this one will go into the history books. It was one of his sort of cliched, and quite often they did, because they're so significant, because nobody else in the country, before or since, has ever undertaken such a wide-ranging sort of keyhole approach to archaeology, where one unit effectively has been able to cover every period of history you could possibly imagine, every region in the country you could possibly imagine. Nobody else has done that. It's an entirely unique undertaking in archaeology anywhere. And I think more should be, we should be recognized more for that.
And I think at one stage we were the second biggest funder of archaeology after English Heritage.
Yeah.
With non-public money, effectively funding research excavation in a way that really isn't normally done, because everybody's waiting for the road bypass or supermarket. And I think Lynn Kerrig Bark was one of the ones I always felt I would have liked to have done more on. Mm-hmm. The big Iron Age hoard deposit there, linked to the end of the Druids in Anglesey. I always felt that I would have wanted to have done more on. I tell you, another site that comes back to my mind as well is the Viking burials we found on the Isle of Man with the woman's hair. I don't know if you remember that. It was on the 13th tee.
How could I forget? Yeah.
The 13th tee of a golf course. and we were supposed to be there looking for a kill site, a kill being a small chapel or holy site. And there on the 13th tee, we found burials, Viking burials. And then halfway through the dig, Matt turns over a piece of slate and written on it in Ogham or whatever it was.
It was in Ogham, yeah.
Yeah. And then Jack is digging away and she finds the hair of a Viking woman still preserved. I mean, that was an extraordinary thing.
Plaited hair.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that site saved my bacon, because the previous one that we'd filmed, which obviously they don't appear in the same order in broadcast, in the order that we excavate them, had been the site where famously we found nothing. So I think I've told you this story before, but that I have to bring you into this, and I'm not having a go. So you gave me a bollocking. This is on day one. Then Tony gave me a bollocking. And I was feeling thoroughly upset with myself and down, and Kerry just kept laughing at me. He used to send me photographs from that site taken from the crane that were just called P45 because there was nothing in the trenches. Oh God. So anyway, Tony was really pissed off and wasn't speaking to me and all the rest of it. And then, halfway through the first day, we popped our first, amazing prehistoric grave. And I think by the end of day 2, he came and shook my hand. This is one of the greatest sites we've ever done. Well done.
Dear.
So all was forgiven, There you go.
Jim, always a great pleasure to talk. I know you're extremely busy and have got lots of things to think about. So good luck with the next stage of everything that's going on.
Thank you. Well, I look forward to speaking again.
I will be coming back for your list of possible definitive fantasy time team sites at another time.
Yes, we need to go through the list of sites we never did. There's definitely a few I can pick out of.
That would be great. I think, and it makes it feel worthwhile, doesn't it? All that effort and all those years of digging and putting work into it and the research and development. The fact that we did crack a few sites that, as Mick said, would go into the history book, I kind of feel that we all deserve a bit of a pat on the back for that.
Well, like I say, and I'm sure others would say the same. For me, the experience of working on Time Team was a joy. And I think that the relationships that were built up through that, that still exist today is a testament to that. The fact that you and I are talking now, however many years after the fact, just goes to show, doesn't it, that it's a powerful thing.